Hey everyone, so today we're turning our attention to ancient China again and the tradition of Confucianism. And this all centers, of course, around this philosopher, I think one of the most influential philosophers on the planet, known to us in the West as Confucius. And did you know that during Confucius's time, roughly 6th century BCE, 1 in 4 people on Earth lived in China. 25% of the planet lived in this one vast region. You know, today it's not that different. Today, 1 out of 5 people on Earth live in the People's Republic of China, 20% of the planet. I guess my point is, when we consider Confucianism, we are considering core world philosophy. And it's a fascinating worldview. It really is. Confucius is not really his name. That's a name given to him by Western explorers, a kind of Latinized version of his Chinese name, which sounds something like Confucius, Kung, the family name, K-U-N-G, Kung, and then Fuzi, or master. So really, Master Kung. And if you run out and get a copy of the Analects, which is the collected sayings and teachings of Confucius, you'll often hear him referred to simply as Master or Master Kung. So he's an odd figure to be the titular head of a major world religion, because he's not a religious figure. He's not a prophet. He's not a mystic. He wasn't interested in metaphysics or afterlife scenarios or what ultimate reality is. I think in today's definitions and vocabulary, we would call him a political consultant, a social philosopher, an ethicist. His area of concern was the human community and our interrelationships with one another. For his working life, he traveled around and offered his services as a consultant to various ministers of government. He had a lot of ideas about political science that he wanted to share, good governance and so on. It doesn't seem that he was terribly successful at that in his career, but he did gather students together, and after his death, they wrote down his sayings and teachings in that little book that we have called the Analects. And so one of the questions is Confucianism a religion or a philosophy? And the answer is yes, but it's a little bit difficult to parse out. You can make a case for both arguments. You can make a case that it's not a religion. Like I said a minute ago, he's not doing the things religions normally do, talking about ultimate reality and the soul and life after death and all of that metaphysical stuff. He's talking about this world and human society. So it doesn't sound very religious. On the other hand, when you dig deeper into Confucian thought, he roots his ethical vision for human society in an idea called Tian, T-I-A-N, Tian, usually translated in English as heaven or the mandate of heaven. A better translation would be something like the ideal, kind of like the Platonic forms of Plato's philosophy, the ideal justice, the ideal goodness upon which we base our definitions of justice and goodness on. But our understanding, our manifestation of justice is a dim shadow of that ideal. That's how Plato framed it anyway. And in Confucianism, there's a bit of that, and it's called the mandate of heaven, because Tian isn't just this inert cosmic structure. It exerts in a way that a mandate creates an imperative. You know, when you mandate something, you're saying to someone that they should do something, that they must do something. There's an exertion of pressure. So in Confucian thought, the mandate of heaven suggests that the cosmic intelligence, the cosmic order, again, not a personified God, but a kind of Tao or Brahman ideal, isn't inert. It presses upon us. It compels us, if we are good people, to carry out the mandate of heaven. We human beings, through our choices and actions, are how the mandate of heaven becomes manifest. In other words, Tian exists only as pure potential until good men and women of conscience, of intellect, of discipline, and of will choose to bring the mandate of heaven down to earth, to bring potentiality into actuality through our behaviors and our choices. Confucianism is a humanism. It is through human behavior that the ideal is brought into reality and into manifestation. This puts human beings front and center in Confucius's project. It's up to us to do it. And so what was the Confucian Project that became so ubiquitous throughout China and throughout the rest of Asia? You know, within a century of his death, he was known throughout China simply as the teacher. And in many ways, Japan is a Confucian society, Korea is a Confucian society, and on and on and on. Confucianism becomes the dominant value system and sociological structure of East Asia. So that's why Confucianism is such a dominant worldview in the world today, and that's why I think Confucius is, if not the most, then one of the most influential philosophers of all time. What is the Confucian Project? Well, what Confucius hoped to accomplish was nothing less than the harmonization of society. He wanted to move society back into harmony. And I say back into harmony because when you read the Analects, you see that he's often referring to about a century before him as a kind of golden age. And in Confucius's own time, there was chaos throughout China. Historians sometimes call it the period of warring states. And in a state of multi-tiered civil war, I'm afraid civilization falls apart. We all kind of notch back down to the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. Forget about self-actualization. It's all about food and water and security. And Confucius loved the arts. He loved what humanity can accomplish when it is in its optimal state. And he wanted to create the conditions in which we could become our most fully human versions of ourselves. And that could only come about, Confucius thought, if we reestablish harmony in society. Unlike some of his political rivals like the realists, who advocated for absolute state power, a kind of an authoritarian state, Confucius's political science led him to argue that you can't simply legislate or from a monarchy dictate morality from the top down. Real virtue, real goodness, real morality, meaningful morality must come up from the bottom. The only way we can transform society, Confucius argues, into its ideal is by cultivating as many excellent individuals as possible, creating virtuous people, the junsu, the superior person, men and women of character, of integrity, of grace, of will, of discipline, of kindness, of humility. And the more of these people you can educate and inculcate, society will eventually reach a tipping point and goodness will become the norm. It's in some ways a romantic, idealized notion, but who is not inspired by that vision of the possible? Who does not dream of a world that works for everyone, that is fair, where everyone is accorded a certain baseline of dignity, where we can all live in a safe place and therefore cultivate our fullest versions of ourselves? This is the vision of Confucianism, that each of us must uncover our own sense of duty in order to live in accord with Tien, with that ideal. And this is what makes Confucius quite a bit like Aristotle, the great student of Plato in 4th century Athens, the great Western philosophy in many ways, the patriarch of logic and the scientific tradition, Aristotle. Like Confucius, Aristotle also thought that human beings have the capacity to cultivate their own virtue, discernment with the intellect, cultivation of the will, particularly the virtue of courage, would lead to the emergence of excellent human beings. Now, both Confucius and Aristotle have their limitations, and there are features of both of their philosophies that we modern people reject, that our contemporary egalitarian view just can't sidle up to. Nevertheless, we recognize that in both ancient China with Confucianism and in ancient Greece with Aristotle, there is a vision of possibility for human actualization of excellence that goes beyond me just satiating my own private needs, but me fitting into a whole with everyone else. But it must come about through training, through a process of habituation. That's why education, and particularly training of the will, is so crucial for Confucius. That's what makes him quite distinct from his contemporary Lao Tzu and the Taoist tradition. You may recall that in Taoism, we framed everything around the idea of wu wei, of creative letting be, of getting the will out of the way, and instead surrendering and allowing myself to move into accord with what is already unfolding. That's quite different than imposing my will. But Confucius's response to Lao Tzu is something like this: how am I going to become a great piano player? By just walking up to a piano, sitting down, and spontaneously and naturally playing piano? No. Confucius says that's not how it works at all. To become a great musician, you must sit on the bench, get some lessons, have the discipline to play every day. And after a few years, you might be a decent piano player. So too, Confucius argues, to become a man or woman of character, of integrity, of morality, of virtue, it does not happen by accident. We may tend toward goodness, but that goodness needs to be trained, taught, cultivated, habituated, and then what we do becomes who we are. And that's Confucius's vision for the transformation of society, creating one virtuous person at a time until virtue catches on. Now, what we need to work on next is this: what are the specific virtues that Confucius believes we should teach the young and that we should ourselves habituate ourselves into? So in our next little video, we'll take a closer look at 3 and maybe a little more of the specific Confucian virtues that will help us fulfill the Confucian Project.